Tobenna Okafor laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind women manufacture to feel silence when men are watching them too closely. She laughed from her stomach, the way her grandmother had taught her to, with her whole chest, head tilting back, like the sound belonged to her, and she wasn't offering a single apology for it. Across the room, Kwon Seojun set down his glass. He had not expected that. In 11 years of running the most feared private syndicate operating between Seoul, Lagos, and London, he had developed a precise understanding of how people behaved when they were afraid of him. They went quiet. They went still. They found reasons to look at anything in the room that was not his face. He had watched grown men lose their train of thought mid-sentence simply because he'd shifted his weight. This woman was laughing at something he had said. Seojun picked up his glass again and studied her over the rim of it. Tobenna Okafor, 31, Enugu-born, London sharpened, currently seated at his dining table in his Seicho estate like she'd been coming here for years. She'd arrived 4 days ago. He'd spent 4 days rearranging his schedule around the fact that she was here, which was not something he had planned to do. She caught him staring. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "That thing where you try to figure me out by looking at me like I'm a document you need to sign." He said nothing, which was as close to your right as he permitted himself. Tobenna reached across the table and stole a piece of meat from his bowl without asking. He watched her do it. She chewed, considered, nodded approval at his cook's work. "You should tell whoever makes this that the pepper ratio is off. My mother would lose her mind." "I'll tell him," he said. "Good." She pushed back her chair. "I'm going to bed. Stop trying to diagnose me. I'm not a problem." She walked out. Seojun sat at the empty table for a long time after, listening to her footsteps climbing the stairs, and tried to remember the last time someone had walked away from him in the middle of a conversation. He couldn't. 3 months before, Tobenna had been eating ground nut soup in her flat in Peckham when her phone rang. She let it ring twice. Habit from years of working in international trade law, where the people who called you never had simple requests. Then she answered. The voice on the other end was crisp, British accented, female. She introduced herself as a representative for an unnamed client. She used words like arrangement and mutual benefit and legally structured. She mentioned Tobenna's law firm, which had been hemorrhaging senior partners since a regulatory scandal that wasn't entirely the firm's fault, but had become entirely the firm's problem. She mentioned Tobenna's younger sister, Chinyeri, whose student visa appeal had been sitting on a home office desk for 4 months with no movement. Then she mentioned a number. Tobenna put down her spoon. "Who's the client?" she said. "Someone who requires a companion of substance, educated, composed. Someone who understands discretion and isn't easily unsettled. That describes half the women I went to university with." "It describes far fewer people than you'd think," the woman said. "Most people, when tested, crumble. And your client tests people extensively." Tobenna was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, a Peckham bus lurched past. Someone was arguing about football 3 floors below. The soup in her bowl had gone slightly cold. "Send me the paperwork," she said. The contract arrived within the hour. She read every word. Not skimming, actually reading. The way she read every contract she'd ever touched. The financial protections were exceptional. The legal coverage was airtight. The privacy clauses were the kind that only got drafted when someone had learned, expensively, what happened without them. And there was a clause about physical presence, about proximity and availability, and what the contract called compatibility assessments. Tobenna read that clause 3 times. Then she called her best friend Ngozi. "I've been offered something ridiculous," she said. "Define ridiculous," Ngozi said. "Korean Mafia, physical arrangement, significant money." A pause. "Are you safe?" "I think so. The paperwork is surprisingly ethical for something so unethical." "Tobenna, I'm gonna do it." "Why?" She looked at the clause again, read the language around it. Words like endurance and resilience, and the careful corporate way it described something raw. "Because," she said slowly, "someone out there built an entire legal document around the fact that every woman he's ever been with has broken. And I want to know what that means." Ngozi was quiet for a long time. "You are the strangest person I've ever loved," she said finally. "I know," Tobenna said warmly, and hung up. Seoul District, day 1. The estate sat behind walls that announced nothing. No intimidating architecture, no guards at the entrance performing threat. Just a gate that opened when the car arrived, and a housekeeper named Kim Jung-suk who received Tobenna with the efficient courtesy of someone who had welcomed many arrivals and made no predictions about how long any of them would last. "Mr. Kwon will see you at dinner," she said, walking Tobenna upstairs. "He doesn't take meetings before 6. "What does he do before 6? "Runs the country, more or less." Tobenna smiled at the back of the woman's head. She liked her immediately. The room she was given was generous without being theatrical. She unpacked her own suitcase, moved the desk toward the window because she liked working with light, and spent 2 hours reviewing a contract dispute she'd left unfinished in London. Then she went downstairs and introduced herself to the kitchen staff, tried to explain what ogiri was to a very patient cook named Daesum, and asked for a tour of the grounds. Seojun didn't appear until 7. He walked into the dining room in a charcoal suit with the jacket already off, loosening his collar as he moved, carrying the compressed energy of someone who had been making high-stakes decisions since sunrise. He stopped when he saw her already seated, already eaten, already halfway through an opinion about a Korean news segment playing on the television mounted on the far wall. "The anchor is wrong about the port agreement," she said, without looking up. "The Nigerian side of that deal has 3 parties, and she's only mentioned 1. Seojun pulled out his chair and sat down. "You follow West African trade policy. I spent 4 years litigating it." He signaled to the staff to serve, looked at her across the table. She was eating with the focused appreciation of someone who genuinely loved food and didn't perform indifference about it. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered the question seriously. "Someone who arrived prepared to endure." Tobenna looked up then, met his eyes directly, the way she'd learned to do in courtrooms full of people who expected her to look away first. "I don't endure things," she said. "I engage with them, or I leave. I haven't left yet." Seojun picked up his chopsticks. "The night is still young," he said. "So it is," she agreed, and went back to her food. Day 9. She heard him before she saw him. It was past midnight, and Tobenna was coming back from the kitchen with a glass of water when she heard it. Not fighting sounds, not anger, just the specific, heavy rhythm of someone pushing their body past the point where most people stop. She followed it to the lower level. The training room was lit, but he hadn't closed the door properly. She stood in the gap and watched. Seojun moved through his practice like a man translating something inexpressible into physical language. Not performance, not exercise, something closer to negotiation, like his body was arguing with his mind and neither had won yet. He stopped, didn't turn around. "You should be sleeping," he said. "You should be sleeping," she replied. He turned then. His face was the most unguarded she'd seen it. Flushed, tired, the controlled composure he wore everywhere else temporarily unavailable. He looked at her with the particular wariness of a man who isn't used to being seen in the middle of something honest. "Tobenna, go back upstairs." "Why?" "Because this isn't..." He stopped. He exhaled. "I'm not good company right now." She leaned against the door frame and crossed her arms. Not moving, not leaving. Just present in the specific way that some people are present.
Fully, without agenda, without commentary. "I'm not here for company," she said. "I'm here because I heard someone working through something alone at midnight, and I know what that looks like." Something shifted in his face. "What does it look like?" he asked quietly, like a person who learned very early that needing help was a weakness. So they turned everything into a practice they could do by themselves. Silence. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He picked up his towel, wiped his face, and sat down on the bench against the wall. After a moment, she walked over and sat beside him. Not close, just there. They sat like that for 20 minutes, not talking, while the house settled around them. Eventually, he said, without preamble, "The first woman I married lasted 6 weeks. Tobenna didn't feel the pulse. She said I made her feel like I was living inside a storm, and the storm didn't know she was there." He looked at his hands. "The second one lasted 4 months. She was braver. She tried to reach me, but I didn't know how to let someone reach me without..." He stopped again. "Without it costing them something," Tobenna said. He looked at her sideways. "You do that?" "What?" "Finish sentences accurately. Occupational habit," she said. "I was a lawyer." She paused. "What happened to the third?" "She left a note," he said. One line. "You're not a bad man. You're just too much for one person to hold." He said it flatly, like a verdict he'd memorized. Tobenna was quiet for a moment. Then, "She was wrong about the second part." He turned to look at her fully. "You don't know that." "I know that the problem wasn't too much." She met his gaze. "The problem was that none of them had enough." The morning that broke his pattern, Seojun woke at 5 a.m. out of habit, reached immediately for his phone. Also habit, but before he touched it, he noticed something that stopped him entirely. He was calm, not the controlled stillness he performed so well that most people mistook it for peace. Actual calm, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind. He lay there for a moment, confused by it. The way you're confused by not having a headache when you expected one. Tobenna was already gone from his side. He could hear her downstairs. He found her in the kitchen at 5:30, standing at the counter in her pajamas, arguing softly with the oven in a mix of English and Igbo. She had flour on her wrist. Dassam the cook was standing nearby, looking both entertained and gently concerned. "What are you doing?" Seojun said. "Making puff puff." She didn't look up. "Your oven lies. The temperature it says and the temperature it means are completely different things. Dassam agrees with me." Dassam, when Seojun looked at him, gave a small diplomatic nod that committed to nothing. "You're cooking at 5 in the morning," Seojun said. "I cook when I'm happy." She finally looked up, read something in his face. You slept properly. It wasn't a question. I did, he said, slightly unnerved by the accuracy. She nodded, like this confirmed something she'd been testing a hypothesis about. Then she turned back to the oven. Sit down. These'll be ready in 10 minutes, and I need someone to be honest with me about whether they're good. He sat. She talked while she worked. About her grandmother's recipe, about the time she tried to make this in her university flat and nearly set off the fire alarm, about Ngozi's theory that Puff Puff was proof that God loved Nigerians. She talked without requiring him to perform anything in return, without watching his face for reactions, without the low-level anxiety he'd come to associate with people who needed him to be owned at all times. He found himself answering, asking questions, disagreeing about something small, and then discovering she disagreed back with equal force and zero hostility. Just conviction. By the time they finished eating, the sun was fully up. He had not checked his phone. The meeting had been scheduled before Tobenna arrived. 8 men, senior partners in the network, coming to Seoul to discuss the American expansion. Seojun had said nothing to her about it, hadn't asked her to stay out of sight exactly, but hadn't invited her either. He assumed she'd understand the implication. He found her at dinner that evening, already seated at the long table, dressed in deep Bordeaux, talking to Director O on her left, a man who had reduced 3 government ministers to apologies in the past year, about the relative merits of Lagos versus Nairobi as commercial hubs, apparently winning the argument. Seojun stopped walking, looked at her. She glanced up, met his eyes across the table, raised one eyebrow barely a millimeter. Did you expect differently? And then turned back to Director O, who was currently explaining something with more animation than he'd shown in any meeting Seojun had run in 2 years. Seojun sat down at the head of the table. Over the next 2 hours, he watched the room shift around her. She didn't perform, didn't try to be impressive. She was simply herself, sharp, curious, unafraid to challenge, and possessed of the specific West African social intelligence that could build genuine warmth with strangers in under 30 minutes. By the time the main course was cleared, she had corrected Director Bake's analysis of the East African port agreements, made Director Yoon laugh twice genuinely, and had a quiet, intense 10-minute conversation with the eldest member of the group about his son's immigration case that ended with the man looking at her the way people look at someone they want their children to know. After everyone left and the house went quiet, Tobenna was on the terrace, shoes off, watching Seoul light up the sky below. Seojun came out and stood beside her. You didn't tell me you were coming to dinner, she said. You didn't tell me not to, she said. Those men respected me, she said simply, which means they'll respect you better. Don't argue with results, Seojun. He looked at her profile, the easy confidence of her posture. The way she stood like the city below was something she was curious about, rather than something she was trying to impress. Director O asked me who you were, he said. What did you tell him? A pause. He hadn't planned to say it this way, but it came out clean and true. I told him you were the person I'd been waiting to meet. She turned to look at him. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, but something softer. The expression of a person receiving something they'd wanted, but hadn't asked for. That's a good answer, she said quietly. I thought so.
Mrs. Kwon arrived on a Tuesday, which was also not planned. She walked through the estate with the brisk ownership of a woman whose son had built the house, but whose judgment had informed every choice in it. She found Tobenna in the library, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Not in a chair, on the floor. Surrounded by 3 open books, eating an apple,
apparently doing research for reasons entirely her own. Mrs. Kwon stood in the doorway. Tobenna looked up, assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds. "You must be his mother," she said. "I'd stand up, but I've lost feeling in my right foot. Give me a moment." She unfolded herself from the floor, shook out her leg, and extended her hand. "Tobenna Okafor, it's genuinely good to meet you." Mrs. Kwon looked at the extended hand. Then she shook it. "You're sitting on the floor," she observed. "The chairs in here are beautiful and not comfortable," Tobenna said. "Someone chose them for how they look. Your son, I imagine." The corner of Mrs. Kwon's mouth moved. "He chose them himself," she confirmed. "I told him at the time." "I'll tell him again," Tobenna said. "He listens. He just needs to hear things multiple times from multiple people before he decides it was his idea." Mrs. Kwon sat down in one of the chairs and looked at Tobenna steadily. "The last woman," she said, "cried every morning for a month." "That sounds exhausting," Tobenna said. "Not unkindly, just accurately. It was. For her." A pause. "The one before spent her time here trying to change him. Into what? Someone less." Mrs. Kwon folded her hands. "She found him to be too much."
Tobenna nodded slowly. "And you want to know if I find him too much?" "I want to know what you find him." Tobenna thought about this seriously, not rushing to reassure, actually thinking. "Difficult," she said finally, "in the way that real things are difficult, not in the way that broken things are." She met the older woman's eyes. "He's carrying a lot of old conclusions about himself that aren't true anymore, but he's not asking me to carry them with him. He's working through them. I think that's the difference." Mrs. Kwon was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood up, picked up one of the books from the floor, looked at the title, and set it back down. "My son was born with too much feeling and not enough language for it. He learned to perform control instead." She moved toward the door. "Most people met the performance. You seem to be meeting something else." She left. Tobenna stood in the empty library for a moment. Then she picked up her apple, sat back down on the floor, and went back to her reading. That evening, Seojun came to find her. "My mother called you unsettling. For her, that's a compliment." Tobenna looked up from her book. "She told me your chair choices were wrong. They're architecturally appropriate. They're painful," she said. "Sit on the floor with me." He looked at the floor, then at her, then with the expression of a man who was choosing battles deliberately. He sat down on the floor beside her. She didn't comment on it, just shifted the book so he could see the page too. He stayed for 2 hours. It was raining, one of those soul rains that comes with intention, steady and serious, making the city outside the windows go soft and muffled. They were lying awake, not talking, just in that specific quiet of two people who have reached the point where silence between them isn't something to be managed.
"I used to monitor the door," Seojun said. Tobenna turned her head. "Which door?" "Every door. I had alerts set on every entrance. Every morning I checked to see if anyone had left in the night." He said it the way people say things they've never said out loud before, with the slightly disoriented quality of someone hearing their own secret in the open air for the first time. 3 years ago, I stopped telling people about it, because I understood it wasn't normal. "How old were you when it started?" she asked. "Probably always." He stared at the ceiling. "The first woman who left, I didn't even know she was going until she was already gone. Something in me decided that was a failure of attention. That if I'd just watched more carefully, you could have stopped her from wanting to leave." Tobenna said. "Yes, that's not how it works. I know that now." A pause. "I knew it then, too. I just didn't believe what I knew." She rolled onto her side. "Did you check the door after I came?" "The first 2 nights," he admitted. "And then?" He turned his head to look at her. "Then I realized I wasn't afraid you'd leave quietly. I was afraid you'd leave loudly, that you'd look me in the face and tell me exactly what was wrong. He watched her expression. That seemed worse. It should be less scary, she said. That kind of leaving is honest. It means you matter enough to explain. He was quiet. Seojun, she said, I'm not building a case against you. I'm not cataloging your failures for a closing argument. I'm just here. Why? He asked. And it wasn't rhetorical. It was the question underneath every interaction they'd had since she arrived. The question he'd been assembling the courage to ask directly. She held his gaze. Because you're the only person I've met in a long time who is exactly as much as he seems. No less, no more. Just exactly what's there.
She reached out and put her hand over his. I find that rare. I find that worth staying for. He turned his hand over under hers, said nothing, didn't need to.
The call came from her mother on a Wednesday, which was how most complicated things began. Her father had been hospitalized. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but the kind of health event that reorders everything, that turns later into now, and eventually into this week. Her mother's voice had the particular pitch of a strong woman working very hard not to ask for what she needed. Tobenna hung up and went to find Seojun. He was in his office, mid-call, but he read her face through the glass wall and ended the conversation in under a minute. A man who understood that some news rearranges the hierarchy of things. My father, she said. I need to go to Lagos. He came around the desk. Didn't reach for her. Just stood close enough to be present. When? Tomorrow, ideally. I'll arrange the flight. I'll arrange my own flight, she said. Not bristling, just clear. But I need to know... She paused, organized her thoughts. I need to know that this doesn't shift what we are. Because I'm going, and I don't know for how long, and I can't be worried about... Go, he said. Simply, directly. She looked at him.
Go take care of your father, he said. Come back when it's done. I'll be here. You're not gonna... Tobenna. He waited until she stopped talking. You have never once asked me to restructure my life around your comfort.
I'm not about to ask you to restructure yours around mine. His jaw was tight, not with suppressed anger, with suppressed feeling, which was a different thing entirely. Go. Call me when you land. She crossed the room and put both arms around him without ceremony, face pressed against his chest, holding on for a moment the way you hold on when you want to memorize how something feels. He held her back, both arms full grip, not controlling, anchoring. See, June, she said into his shirt. I'll be back. I know. He said. And the steadiness in his voice told her that for the first time, this wasn't something he had to convince himself of. He actually knew. Lagos received her back like an argument she loved. Her mother had the house at full capacity within 24 hours. Ainies arriving, bearing food and opinions, cousins whose children had grown into strangers, neighbors who came under the pretense of sympathy and stayed for the conversation. Her father, propped in his hospital bed, was holding court with the energy of a man who had decided to recover through the power of being too stubborn to do otherwise. Tobenna moved through it all at full speed. Hospitals in the mornings, family management in the afternoons, paperwork and her father's business accounts in the evenings. She was good at this. Not because she was self-sacrificing, but because she was genuinely competent, and organization was its own kind of love. She and Seojun spoke every night. He called at 10 p.m. Lagos time, which was 6 a.m. in Seoul, which meant he was calling her before he did anything else in his day. She noted this without commenting on it. He asked real questions about her father's prognosis, about the business complications, about what her mother needed that she wasn't asking for. He remembered details from previous calls. He occasionally sent things. A specialist he'd made a quiet inquiry about, a document she'd mentioned needing that had appeared in her inbox before she'd had to ask. He never said, "I miss you." He showed it in the precision of his attention. One night, she told him about her father's first question when she'd walked into the hospital room. "He looked at me," she said, "and the first thing he asked was whether I was happy. Not, are you okay? Not what's happening with work. Just, are you happy?" A pause on the line. "What'd you tell him?" "I told him yes." She looked out the window of her childhood bedroom at the Lagos night. "And I meant it," which surprised me a little. Another pause. Then, "I'm glad." "Me too," she said. She came back on a Thursday. Seojun was waiting at the estate, not at the gate, inside, in the entrance hall, hands in his pockets, jacket off, looking like a man who had decided some time ago that he wasn't going to pretend he hadn't been counting the days. Tobenna walked in, dropped her bag, and looked at him. "He looked tired," she said. "I didn't sleep well," he said. "For how long?" "Most of the time you were gone." She crossed the hall and walked into him directly. No approach, no ceremony, just the specific directness that had characterized everything about her from the beginning. She put her face against his neck, and he wrapped both arms around her, and they stood like that in the entrance hall, while the door was still open and the evening air moved through it. "You're ridiculous," she said against his collar. "Probably," he agreed. "You could have told me you weren't sleeping." "And then what?" he said. "You'd have worried about me instead of focusing on your father. I didn't want that." She pulled back and looked at his face, studied him the way she'd been studying him for months, not searching for cracks, just seeing him. "You're getting better at that," she said. "At what?" "Choosing not to be lonely out of pride." She touched his jaw. "That's a real thing, Seojun. Don't let it go unnoticed." He turned his face slightly into her hand, an involuntary movement, like a man who had stopped pretending he didn't need things. "Your father?" he said. "Recovering. Furious about the dietary restrictions. My mother is enjoying having authority over his meals for the first time in 37 years. He almost smiled. Actually, almost. Good. They had dinner together that night. Daysum had made something specific that Tobenna had mentioned once, 3 months ago, in a casual conversation. She noticed. She looked at Daysum, who gave the bearish shrug that said, "He asked me to remember." And she looked at Seojun, who was reading something and pretending he hadn't seen the exchange. She said nothing, just ate, pressed her foot lightly against his under the table. He pressed back. The change in Seojun didn't announce itself. It moved through him quietly, the way water moves through rock, not visible day to day, but undeniable over time. He stopped monitoring the doors. He didn't notice when it happened, only noticed after the fact that the habit had fallen away like a piece of clothing he'd outgrown. He started keeping different hours, not because Tobenna asked him to, but because he found himself wanting to be present for specific small things. Morning coffee, her running commentary on whatever news she was reading, the 20 minutes she spent on the phone with Ngozi every Sunday that always ended with both of them laughing about something that apparently could never be adequately explained to people who hadn't been there. He sat in on one of these calls accidentally and heard Tobenna describe him to Ngozi as the most controlled chaos I've ever decided to love, and somehow also the most restful person I know. He had stood in the hallway outside the room for a full minute after that, processing the information. Love. She had said it to someone else before she'd said it to him.
And somehow, that made it more real. People performed love to the person they wanted to believe it. They told the truth to their best friends. He went into the room. She looked up from the phone, saw his face, and covered the receiver. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Carry on." And he sat down across from her and waited for her to finish her call. And when she did, she set the phone down and looked at him. "You heard," she said. "I heard." She held his gaze. "Was that okay?" "More than okay," he said. His voice had done something, lost some of its habitual control, turned into something less composed and more true. "I just needed a moment." "Take all the moments you need," she said. He looked at her, this woman who had arrived in his life with flour on her hands and opinions about his oven, and the absolute unshakable certainty of someone who had never once confused being loved with being consumed. "I don't want to wait to say it back," he said. "I don't want to be the person who performs control at the expense of honesty anymore." She waited. "I love you," he said, like he was setting something down that had gotten very heavy. "In the specific way that means I want your life to be excellent, with or without me in it. In the way that your happiness is not a threat to mine. In the way..." He stopped. "In all the ways I didn't think I knew how." Tobenna stood up, crossed the room in 4 steps, and kissed him like a woman who had been right about something and was fully entitled to enjoy being right. He took her somewhere. Didn't explain where. Just said, "Dress for wind," and drove south until the city became coast, and the coast became cliff, and the cliff became a place that seemed to exist at the edge of everything. There was no elaborate setup, a blanket, a bag of food she suspected Daysome had packed, the sound of the sea doing what the sea does, old, indifferent, continuous. They sat at the edge and ate and watched the water, and she knew. She had known for some time. She just waited to see what shape he decided to put around it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, gathering the words with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that language mattered. "I used to believe that I was the kind of person other people survived," he said. "That the best case scenario was someone brave enough to stay, despite me." He looked at the water. "I built my entire life around that premise, around managing my intensity so it damaged people less, around keeping enough distance that when they left, I could tell myself it was the distance that drove them away and not me." She said nothing. Let him have the space. "And then you sat on my kitchen counter, eating my cook's food without permission, and told me my oven was a liar, and argued with my senior partner about port agreements, and sat on my floor." He turned to look at her, and his eyes had that quality they only had in private, the unguarded version, and somehow none of it felt like survival. It never looked at me like I was something to get through. "You're not something to get through," she said. "I know that now." He reached into his jacket, pulled out something small, held it in his closed fist for a moment before opening his hand. A ring. Simple. Gold. Exactly the weight of something chosen carefully, rather than performed grandly. "Tobenna Okafor," he said. "I am not asking you to save me. I'm not asking you to endure me. I'm not offering you a version of myself that has been reduced to something manageable." He met her eyes. "I'm asking you, as exactly who I am, completely, at full volume. If you choose this, choose us,
permanently, freely. She looked at the ring, then at his face. Then she did something he hadn't anticipated. She laughed, not nervously, not to feel silence, from her stomach, the way her grandmother had taught her, with her whole chest. He blinked. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She wiped her eye. I came here because I was curious about a man who had made everyone who loved him feel like they weren't enough." She shook her head. "And you turned out to be the one who hadn't been enough for yourself." He stared at her. "Give me the ring," she said. He placed it in her palm. She put it on herself, deliberately, unhurried, with the same easy ownership she brought to everything that mattered to her. Then she held out her hand and looked at it. "Yes," she said, "completely, freely, at full volume." After they got married in the private garden behind the Seoul estate on a Saturday in June. 41 people. Her parents flew in from Lagos, her father moving slowly, but moving, stubborn and present, which was more than enough. Her sister Chinyere, Ngozi, who cried from the second Tobenna appeared and then spent the rest of the day denying it. Mrs. Kwon sat in the front row and said nothing during the ceremony, which those who knew her understood as the highest possible form of approval. Seojun held Tobenna's hands and said what he'd said on the cliff, and a few things he hadn't, about the specific kind of quiet she'd brought into his life, about learning that love could be both enormous and restful, about the fact that she'd fixed the chair situation in the library by simply replacing 2 of them with cushions she'd ordered herself without asking, which somehow captured everything. She laughed, there, in front of 41 people, from her stomach. The reception went late. The song had cooked, properly, the pepper ratio corrected after 3 conversations and 1 taste test. Her aunties and his mother found each other in a corner early in the evening and were deep in conversation until midnight, which no one had predicted, and both of them apparently found entirely natural. At the end of the night, standing at the edge of the garden with her shoes off and his jacket on her shoulders, Tobenna looked out at the city lights. Seojun came to stand behind her, put his chin on her shoulder, wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I went to Peckham for groundnut soup," she said, "and somehow ended up here." He laughed, actual laughter, full, unguarded, real. The sound of a man who had finally stopped rationing joy. She turned in his arms and looked at his face. "There it is," she said softly. "There what is?" "You. Properly." She touched his face. "No armor." He turned his face into her palm, eyes closed, just breathing. "I used to think armor was the same as strength," he said. "I know. You didn't try to remove it." "No," she said. "I just stood close enough that you stopped needing it." Behind them, the party continued. Someone had found a speaker. Her cousin was teaching Seojun's junior associates an Afrobeat step they were executing with varying levels of success and complete commitment. Tobenna watched and felt something settle through her. Not the sharp satisfaction of being right, not the heat of triumph, just the deep, unhurried warmth of a life that had found its shape. She had walked into a storm. It had turned out the storm had been waiting, not to destroy something, but to meet something strong enough to make it want to be still. There are women who survive powerful men. And then there are women who walk in, sit on the floor, eat the food without asking, argue about pepper ratios, and love so surely so freely, so completely without shrinking, that the most powerful man in the room quietly dismantles every wall he spent a lifetime building. Not because she asked him to, because she made him want to. That is not survival. That is revolution.